The winter of 1895 was no ordinary season. Across Britain, rivers froze solid, trains halted mid-journey, and families huddled together in houses so cold that frost formed on the inside of their walls. For the rich, it was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was a fight for survival. Beneath the snow and silence, stories of resilience, tragedy, and unexpected ingenuity unfolded. Stories that history has all but forgotten. Tonight, we step into a frozen empire where every breath was a gamble, and every ember of warmth was a victory against the cold. The winter of 1895 struck Britain with a force that was both unexpected and unforgettable. By early January, newspapers across the country began to report what had started as a sharp cold spell but quickly turned into one of the most severe winters of the century. The Times, on the 12th of January, ran the headline, "Intense cold Thames frozen in several places." The words carried an eerie weight. It had been generations since Londoners had seen the river harden to such an extent, recalling memories of the famous frost fairs of the early 19th century. This was not a brief frost or a picturesque snow covering. The freeze of 1895 was relentless, stretching from late December into March, with the coldest weeks felt most brutally in January and February. Temperatures across England, Scotland, and Wales plummeted well below freezing for weeks on end. In Oxford, records showed temperatures dipping to -17 degrees Celsius. In parts of Scotland, even lower. Britain, a nation unaccustomed to such long-lasting cold, was suddenly at the mercy of ice and snow. From the first days of January, signs of disruption multiplied. Trains stalled on frozen tracks. Telegraph wires snapped under the weight of ice. Water pipes burst in towns and cities, leaving streets coated in treacherous sheets of ice. The Illustrated London News printed engravings of snowbound streets and men breaking ice on the Thames, giving readers a sense of both awe and dread. For the people living through it, the novelty quickly turned to hardship. One of the starkest indicators of the freeze was the transformation of Britain's rivers and canals. Reports flooded in. The Thames at Oxford, the Cam in Cambridge, the Mersey in Liverpool, and the Tyne in Newcastle were all partially or entirely frozen. The Manchester Guardian noted on January 14th, "The Irwell has been rendered impassable by thick sheets of ice, and barges lie stranded, unable to move. Commerce that depended on waterways came to a halt. Bargemen, ferrymen, and dock workers were left without wages." Diaries of the period reveal the shock of ordinary people. In her journal, Beatrice Webb, the social reformer, wrote of the extraordinary bitterness of the cold and the strain it placed on London's poor. She described how even in middle-class homes, ice formed on the inside of bedroom windows and water jugs froze solid overnight. For families living in single-room tenements, conditions were nothing short of brutal. The freeze coincided with economic hardship, amplifying its effects. Coal, the primary source of heating, became more expensive as demand surged. The poor, unable to stockpile supplies, resorted to burning scraps of wood, rubbish, or even furniture to keep warm. Reports from the East End of London describe families huddled together in beds, wrapped in layers of rags, with little protection from the wind that whistled through broken window panes. By mid-January, the scale of the freeze was undeniable. The Morning Post warned the cold spell, now entering its third week, has claimed dozens of lives, chiefly among the very young and the elderly, who are most susceptible to its cruel grasp. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza spread rapidly in overcrowded housing. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from respiratory illnesses, and death notices in local papers grew longer with each passing day. The countryside fared no better. Farmers watched helplessly as livestock perished in frozen fields. Sheep, unable to graze under layers of snow, starved by the thousands. In Yorkshire, reports emerged of farmers digging through snowdrifts to reach their animals, only to find them dead. For rural communities already struggling with low agricultural prices, the freeze was disastrous. Rail transport, the backbone of Britain's industrial economy, faltered under the strain. The Midland Railway Company reported dozens of stalled trains due to frozen points and snow-blocked lines. Passengers were stranded for hours, sometimes overnight, in unheated carriages. Newspapers published accounts of gallant efforts by workers who labored with shovels and picks to clear snow from the tracks. Despite their efforts, delays were constant, and industries dependent on timely deliveries faced severe disruptions. The freeze also transformed daily life in unexpected ways. Skating mania swept the country, with ponds, canals, and rivers frozen solid. Thousands flocked to the ice. In London's Regent's Park, vast crowds gathered to skate or watch daring races. The Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News celebrated the revival of a pastime that Britain had not seen on such a scale for decades. But the joy was shadowed by tragedy. On January 15th, a large crowd gathered on the frozen Serpentine in Hyde Park, when the ice gave way beneath dozens of skaters. Several people drowned. The incident was widely reported, a reminder that even in recreation, the freeze carried risks. For the working poor, the spectacle of skating on the Thames was a cruel contrast to their suffering. Philanthropists and charities sprang into action. The Salvation Army opened soup kitchens across London, serving thousands of meals a day. The Mansion House Fund, organised by the Lord Mayor of London, raised money to provide coal and blankets to the needy. Newspapers praised these efforts, but the scale of poverty was overwhelming. In some districts, entire families were reported to have succumbed to the cold. Their deaths discovered only days later. The psychological impact of the freeze was profound. Britain, accustomed to unpredictable but relatively mild winters, was unprepared for a sustained assault of ice and snow. The Times described the streets of London as unearthly, silent, muffled by snow and emptied by necessity. Letters to editors reflected a mix of awe and despair. Awe at the beauty of a world blanketed in white. Despair at the human suffering hidden beneath it. Scientific observers took note of the event's extremity. The Meteorological Office, established only a few decades earlier, recorded January 1895 as one of the coldest months in its dataset, with mean temperatures several degrees below average. The long duration of the freeze, combined with repeated snowfalls, made it exceptional in Britain's climatic history. Some contemporaries speculated about changes in atmospheric patterns or divine punishment, while others simply marveled at nature's power. By February, as the freeze continued, more accounts emerged from across the nation. In Newcastle, miners complained that frozen roads prevented coal from reaching towns, leaving households without fuel despite living near abundant reserves. In Liverpool, docks lay idle, with ships unable to move through the icy Mersey. In Edinburgh, the Forth froze along its edges, disrupting ferry crossings. The scale of disruption was national, not local. The cultural memory of the winter of 1895 was shaped by these shared experiences. It became known as the Great Frost, remembered alongside the legendary freezes of the 17th and 18th centuries. But unlike earlier centuries, this freeze struck a Britain transformed by industrialization, urbanization, and vast social inequality. The contrasts were stark. Lavish winter balls held in heated mansions, while paupers froze in alleys. This duality was not lost on commentators, who used the freeze as a metaphor for the coldness of Victorian society toward its poor. By March, the grip of winter finally began to loosen. The thaw revealed the true extent of the damage. Flooded fields, ruined crops, collapsed roofs, and an untold number of lives lost to exposure and disease. Yet for those who lived through it, the memory of weeks spent in a Britain frozen solid lingered. Diaries, newspapers, and engravings preserved the event, not only as a meteorological anomaly, but as a test of endurance, resilience, and charity. The winter of 1895 stood as a stark reminder of nature's ability to humble a powerful empire. It revealed the fragility of modern systems, railways, telegraphs, supply chains, when confronted by unyielding cold. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the poor and magnified the divides of class. And it left behind a story etched in ice, a frozen empire that no Victorian who survived it would ever forget. In the Britain of 1895, survival in winter depended on one thing above all else: coal. Coal was more than fuel. It was warmth in the hearth, steam in the engine, light in the factory, and energy for every corner of Victorian life. By the final decade of the 19th century, Britain was producing nearly 200 million tons of coal a year, a figure unmatched anywhere in the world. It was the backbone of an empire, dug from the seams of South Wales, the Midlands, Yorkshire, Northumberland, and Scotland. Yet when the Great Frost of 1895 struck, the very abundance of coal could not shield ordinary people from hardship. Instead, it revealed the deep divides of Victorian society between those who could afford a steady fire in their grate and those who could not. By early January, the sudden surge in demand began to drive prices upward. The Morning Post reported that coal is fetching nearly double its ordinary price in several districts of London. For the wealthy, this was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was catastrophic. In overcrowded East End tenements, families often survived on day-to-day wages, buying small quantities of coal or wood as money allowed. A sharp rise in prices meant going without fuel altogether. The accounts from charitable visitors in London reveal the stark reality. In the slums of Whitechapel and Stepney, investigators found households where fires had gone out days before, leaving rooms coated in frost. Some families burned furniture, broken boxes, or scraps of rubbish to generate a few minutes of heat. Others huddled together under layers of rags and blankets, hoping to outlast the night. Even in the middle-class suburbs, the cold penetrated daily life. Beatrice Webb wrote in her diary that she and her husband Sidney awoke to find the water jug by their bedside frozen solid. She noted the miserable plight of those with no coal at all, recognizing that if her well-appointed home struggled, conditions in poorer neighborhoods must have been unbearable. Coal shortages were made worse by the very weather that created the demand. Snow and ice clogged transport routes, halting coal deliveries to cities. Barges that carried coal along rivers and canals were immobilized, trapped in frozen waterways. In Newcastle, a hub of coal shipping, reports told of vessels lying idle as the Tyne froze along its banks. Trains carrying coal southward were delayed or cancelled. leaving London and the industrial Midlands short of supply. The problem was not a lack of coal in the ground, but the inability to move it quickly enough. The Manchester Guardian on January 18th described the paradox. The North sits upon mountains of fuel, yet in the capital fires dwindle and die. For those who could still afford it, coal remained the central defense against the cold. Fires were kept burning in drawing rooms, parlors, and kitchens, the glowing hearth a symbol of comfort. In Victorian culture, the coal fire was more than warmth. It was an emblem of domestic stability. The poet Coventry Patmore once described it as the altar of the home, around which family life revolved. To lose the fire in winter was to lose a sense of security. Candles, too, played their part. While gas lighting had spread across much of London and other large cities by the 1890s, millions of homes, particularly in poorer districts and rural villages, still relied on candles or oil lamps. During the freeze, as pipes burst and gas supplies faltered, candles became more important. Their dim glow lit cramped rooms where windows were crusted with ice. Entire households might ration a single candle, snuffed out quickly to conserve it. The image of Britain in 1895 was a nation lit by flickering flames, coal fires for the fortunate, candles for the poor. Both carried risks. Fires left unattended in drafty homes could ignite rags or kindling, leading to fatal blazes. Candles, too, tipped over or placed too close to curtains, were responsible for house fires reported in local papers throughout January and February. For families already on the edge of survival, a blaze could mean not only loss of home but death. The government took note of the crisis but offered little direct aid. Britain in the late Victorian era was not yet a welfare state, and official responses to hardship were limited. Instead, the burden fell to charitable organizations, churches, and philanthropic individuals. The Mansion House Fund, organized by the Lord Mayor of London, distributed coal and blankets to thousands of families. The Salvation Army reported giving out thousands of hot meals daily to those who could not afford food or fuel. In Manchester, local newspapers organized coal relief drives, encouraging wealthier citizens to contribute. Despite these efforts, the need far outstripped supply. Reports from the period describe endless queues outside relief stations, with desperate families waiting for hours in the snow to receive a small bag of coal or a blanket. For many, it was the difference between survival and death. The coal crisis also exposed the harsh realities of Victorian labour. In the collieries themselves, miners continued to work in freezing conditions, their labour in demand more than ever. Yet even as they extracted thousands of tons of coal, many miners' own families suffered from shortages when transport delays prevented the fuel from reaching local markets. Strikes and protests were rare in the bitter cold, but the underlying tensions between miners, coal owners, and government officials simmered beneath the surface. Not all accounts were of misery. Among the middle and upper classes, coal fires fueled winter entertainments. Country houses held grand gatherings, with roaring fires in great halls warding off the chill. In the cities, theatres continued performances, their interiors heated by coal furnaces, though audiences often arrived shivering from the journey. Wealth insulated some from the worst effects of the freeze, though even the rich found their routines disrupted when horses slipped on icy streets or trains failed to arrive. The symbolism of coal during the winter of 1895 was powerful. It revealed the dependency of an entire empire on a single resource. Britain's industrial might, its railways, factories, and homes. All relied on the steady flow of black fuel from the mines. When that flow was interrupted, the vulnerability of the system became apparent. Coal was not just a commodity, it was survival itself. As February arrived, the situation grew more desperate. Newspapers published daily updates on coal prices, often accompanied by grim reports of deaths from exposure. In Birmingham, a coroner's inquest recorded the death of a woman found frozen in her bed, her fire long extinguished for want of fuel. In Glasgow, police discovered a family of 5 who had died of cold and hunger in a single room. These tragedies became symbols of a wider national crisis. At the same time, the freeze inspired calls for reform. Social reformers argued that no nation so rich in resources should allow its citizens to freeze for lack of access to them. The Pall Mall Gazette published editorials demanding better regulation of coal supplies and more coordinated relief in future crises. The debate over how much responsibility the state should take in protecting its citizens was sharpened by the bitter cold. When the thaw finally came in March, the coal crisis eased as transportation resumed and prices fell. But the memory of those weeks lingered. For many, the winter of 1895 was remembered not only for the frozen rivers and snowbound streets, but for the struggle to keep fires alight in the hearth. Coal had defined the season, a lifeline for some, an unattainable luxury for others. In the years that followed, the freeze entered popular memory as one of the coldest winters of the century. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that industrial power did not guarantee protection against nature, and at its center was the story of coal and candles, symbols of both resilience and inequality in a frozen empire. When the Great Frost of 1895 tightened its grip, Britain's streets transformed into landscapes both mesmerizing and menacing. For those who lived through it, the memory was etched not in scenic beauty but in the daily hazards of navigating cities and towns where cobblestones disappeared beneath sheets of ice, and where snowdrifts rose as high as doorways. The cold had already brought rivers and canals to a standstill, but it was on the streets that ordinary life faltered most dramatically. London, the heart of the empire, became a city where even the simplest act of walking to work or school was fraught with danger. In January, the Illustrated London News depicted scenes of men scattering salt and ashes along the main thoroughfares. Despite these efforts, the freezing temperatures made such measures nearly useless. Streets turned into glass-like surfaces, reflecting gas lamps in eerie patterns at night. Horse-drawn carriages, essential for both private travel and commerce, slipped and crashed with alarming frequency. Reports in the daily news chronicled accidents daily, horses collapsing on the icy surfaces, wagons overturning, and passengers thrown into the snow. In Holborn and Clerkenwell, police officers were deployed not only for public order, but to help lift fallen horses back to their feet. Veterinary surgeons described the winter as disastrous for working animals, with thousands injured or killed in accidents across the country. The risks extended to pedestrians. Hospitals in London reported a surge in admissions for broken bones, sprains, and concussions from slips and falls. The British Medical Journal noted a remarkable rise in cases of fractures, particularly of the arm and hip, attributed directly to the frozen streets. For the elderly, a simple walk could prove fatal. Cities beyond London faced similar struggles. In Manchester, the Irwell overflowed after sudden thaws, leaving frozen sheets of water across adjacent streets. In Birmingham, industrial smoke combined with frost to create a thick, choking fog, reducing visibility to a few feet. Edinburgh and Glasgow contended with steep, icy roads that became nearly impassable, forcing people to cling to railings or risk sliding down entire streets. The visual drama of cities turned into skating rinks was undeniable. But for residents, it meant disruption and danger. Public transportation suffered greatly. Horse-drawn trams struggled to climb icy inclines. In some areas, tram services ceased entirely, leaving workers to trudge long distances through treacherous conditions. Train stations, already hampered by frozen points and snowbound lines, became crowded with frustrated passengers. The Times ran stories of thousands stranded in waiting rooms, forced to sleep on benches as trains failed to arrive. The Empire's proud railway system, usually a symbol of industrial might, appeared helpless before the weight of ice. The disruption was not limited to movement of people. Deliveries of food and goods were delayed or halted, adding to shortages in towns and cities. Bakers reported running out of flour as supplies failed to arrive. Milk froze solid in churns before it could reach households. Letters and newspapers arrived days late, carried by exhausted postmen who trudged through snowdrifts with their bags. Street life itself altered dramatically. Markets, usually bustling with sound and color, dwindled as traders stayed home or found their stalls buried in snow. In East London, open-air markets like Petticoat Lane fell silent, their vendors unable to display goods on frozen cobbles. The silence of once noisy streets unsettled observers. One London correspondent wrote, "The capital is hushed, as though time itself were bound in frost. Yet amidst hardship, the streets also became sites of fascination. Children turned ice-goated roads into playgrounds, sliding for yards at a time while adults watched nervously. Makeshift sleds appeared, fashioned from boxes or planks. Skating spilled beyond rivers and ponds, with daring youths attempting to glide along frozen alleys. For them, the ice was not only an obstacle but an unexpected gift. Authorities struggled to balance safety with practicality. Local councils organized crews to spread grit and ashes. But resources were limited, and the sheer scale of the freeze overwhelmed their efforts. In some districts, residents were encouraged to spread their own ashes or sand outside homes to protect pedestrians. Wealthier households complied. Poorer ones lacked even that. The visual spectacle of the streets did not escape artists and photographers, though photography was still cumbersome. Images survive of carriages stuck in snowdrifts, of policemen directing skaters off unsafe ice, and of shop fronts glazed with icicles. These images appeared in illustrated papers, feeding public fascination with the Great Frost, even as many readers suffered its consequences firsthand. The freeze also transformed nightlife. Taverns and public houses, normally lively, saw declining attendance as people avoided hazardous journeys in the dark. Theaters struggled with empty seats when audiences could not reach them safely. Some establishments advertised free hot drinks or coal-heated waiting rooms to lure patrons. Still, many stayed home, gathering by whatever warmth they could muster. The vibrant pulse of Victorian urban evenings slowed to a crawl. For those forced to endure the streets, such as policemen, lamplighters, and night watchmen, conditions were grueling. Reports tell of constables patrolling in pairs to avoid succumbing to exposure, stamping their boots to keep circulation alive. Lamplighters battled ice to ignite the city's gas lamps, sometimes unable to reach the tops of poles coated in frost. Night watchmen, already poorly paid, faced hours in sub-zero conditions with little more than a lantern for comfort in the countryside. Villages experienced similar transformations. Roads between towns became impassable, covered with snowdrifts that reached the height of hedgerows. Carriages overturned in ditches, and farmers resorted to sledges to move supplies. Isolated hamlets were cut off for days, relying on local stores and neighborly charity to endure. The icy stillness of rural lanes, often romanticized in paintings, masked the vulnerability of communities left stranded. Religious processions and funerals, integral to Victorian society, faced particular challenges. Hearses could not navigate icy streets, leading to delays in burials. Some coffins were carried by hand when horses refused to move on frozen inclines. Churches, serving as both places of worship and refuges of warmth, became central gathering points, their surrounding paths trodden into icy ruts by crowds of desperate parishioners. The economic toll of immobilized streets was immense. Businesses closed for lack of workers or customers. Small shops in particular suffered as foot traffic dwindled and supplies vanished. Street vendors, who relied on daily trade, faced ruin. The winter that transformed streets into dazzling ice sheets also deepened poverty for those whose livelihoods depended on the bustle of public life. At the same time, stories of resilience emerged. Neighbors pooled resources to clear paths, share coal, or help the elderly cross dangerous roads. Charity workers braved the conditions to deliver food and blankets. These acts, reported in local papers, highlighted both the fragility and the solidarity of communities under stress. By February, the icy grip showed little sign of easing. The mourning leader lamented, "Every pavement glistens like glass. The streets of London are no longer thoroughfares, but traps." Accidents continued and frustration mounted, yet the stark beauty of the frozen city left an indelible impression. Writers described St. Paul's Cathedral rising over a sea of white rooftops, the Thames embankment gleaming with frost, and the silence of horse hooves muffled by snow. When the thaw finally came in March, the streets presented new dangers. Melting snow turned to torrents, flooding low-lying districts. Ice loosened from roofs, crashing onto unsuspecting passers-by. The relief of mobility was tempered by the destruction of property and the stench of thawed refuse that had lain hidden for weeks. Still, the memory of the frozen streets lingered. For the Victorians, it was a reminder that even the might of their industrial empire could be humbled. The cobblestones of London, the arteries of Manchester, the closes of Edinburgh, all had been transformed into a glistening empire of ice, beautiful to behold, but perilous to live through. The Great Frost of 1895 was not only a battle against cold, it was a battle against hunger. When Britain's fields, rivers, and supply routes froze, the lifelines that fed millions were suddenly cut. What began as an inconvenience soon became a crisis. For centuries, Britain had been vulnerable to harsh winters that threatened food supplies, but by the late 19th century, many assumed the nation's growing industrial and imperial networks would shield it from shortages. The winter of 1895 proved otherwise. The prolonged freeze disrupted agriculture, fisheries, and trade, forcing entire communities to endure weeks of scarcity. In towns and cities, the first signs of hunger appeared as early as January. The Morning Post reported that milk deliveries froze solid in churns before they could reach households. Buttermilk, a staple for poorer families, became scarce as dairy cattle struggled in frozen fields. In rural districts, snow-covered pastures left livestock without food. Farmers in Yorkshire and Wales recorded the loss of thousands of sheep, their bodies found buried under drifts or starved in the open. Poultry perished in unheated barns, and pigs froze where they slept. Vegetables too were ravaged by frost. Cabbages and potatoes, the backbone of working-class diets, blackened in the fields. Carrots and turnips split under the ice. In Scotland, crofters on marginal lands faced near ruin as root crops rotted in frozen soil. The Scotsman newspaper lamented a harvest undone in a single night of frost. Fishing communities, usually reliable suppliers of food in winter, suffered equally. Rivers were locked in ice, preventing local catches of eels and freshwater fish. The Thames, the Severn, and countless smaller waterways became barren sheets of white. At sea, storms combined with the freeze to keep fishing vessels in port. Harbours along the east coast of England saw fleets immobilized, while frozen nets and iced-over decks made the few attempts to sail dangerously impractical. Without fish, coastal markets went bare. For working-class families already strained by the rising cost of coal, the shortage of food compounded misery. Bread prices rose steadily through January and February. Bakers, facing delayed flour deliveries, limited their production. In some districts, long queues formed outside bakeries before dawn, with families desperate to secure a loaf. The Manchester Courier reported that crowds gathered daily outside bakeries in Salford, and many left empty-handed when supplies ran out. Charitable organizations stepped in. Soup kitchens opened across the country, serving meals to thousands each day. The Salvation Army, already active in London's poorest neighborhoods, recorded feeding over 3,000 people daily in Whitechapel alone. The kitchens offered simple, fair broth made of bones, vegetables, and barley, but for many, it was the only hot food they would see in days. Photographs from the period show long lines of gaunt men, women, and children waiting in snow-covered streets for a ladle of soup. Parliament, slow to respond, debated the crisis in February. Members discussed the plight of agricultural communities and the urban poor, but direct government relief remained limited. Victorian Britain was still governed by the principle that poverty should be addressed primarily through charity, not state intervention. As a result, survival often depended on the generosity of neighbours, churches, and philanthropists. In London, the Mansion House Fund raised thousands of pounds to distribute food parcels alongside coal and blankets. Middle-class donors contributed, motivated both by compassion and by fear of unrest. For decades, reformers had warned that hunger in the East End could spark riots, as it had in earlier centuries. The harsh winter revived those anxieties. Police patrolled heavily in working-class districts, wary of crowds gathering outside food depots. Despite these efforts, starvation was not avoided. Coroner's inquests in January and February recorded cases of families found dead in unheated rooms with no food in their homes. Newspapers described the deaths with grim detail, fueling public debate. In Birmingham, a widow and her 2 children were discovered in their lodging house, having eaten nothing for days. In Glasgow, charitable workers reported entire tenements subsisting on tea and bread crusts. The Daily Chronicle ran the headline, "The Hidden Hunger of the Poor." In rural Britain, hunger took a different form. Farmers unable to feed their livestock faced ruin. Without hay or root crops to sustain animals, many were forced to slaughter sheep and cattle prematurely, flooding markets with cheap meat in some regions, while others saw no supply at all. The imbalance left certain areas with relative abundance and others with devastating shortages. In Norfolk, Villagers ate mutton daily for a brief period, while in South Wales, meat was unattainable at any price. Schools reported declines in attendance as children weakened by hunger and cold remained at home. Teachers wrote of pupils fainting in classrooms or arriving without shoes to protect their feet from icy roads. Medical officers, already overwhelmed by outbreaks of pneumonia and influenza, warned that malnutrition left children more vulnerable to disease. The long-term effects of the winter on child health would be felt for years. The shortages extended even to the middle classes. Diaries and letters from clerks, shopkeepers, and professionals record frustration at high prices and empty markets. Though not starving, they complained of monotonous diets. Bread, porridge, and whatever preserved food could be obtained. For households accustomed to modest variety, the winter meant a return to the barest essentials. Among the wealthy, the crisis was felt only faintly. Country estates, stocked with game and provisions, continued to host banquets. Newspapers reported on lavish dinners of venison, pheasant, and wine, a stark contrast to the hunger in nearby villages. These accounts fueled resentment and highlighted the deep divide between classes. Reformers seized upon the disparity, using it as evidence of the urgent need for social change. Religious institutions framed the hunger in moral terms. Clergymen preached about the duty of the rich to aid the poor. Some interpreted the frost as divine judgment on Britain's neglect of its vulnerable citizens. Churches became central distribution points for bread and soup, their aisles crowded with the destitute. Sermons during Lent emphasized sacrifice, drawing a parallel between Christ's suffering and the endurance required in the frozen season. The psychological impact of hunger was profound. Reports describe children scouring refuse heaps for scraps of food or begging at the doors of bakeries. Adults pawned their last possessions to buy bread or coal. Letters to newspapers revealed a sense of despair, with readers pleading for relief and warning of a famine in the midst of empire. By late February, the worst of the hunger began to ease as small thaws allowed limited deliveries. Yet the scars remained. Families that had sold furniture, tools, or clothing to survive emerged from the winter impoverished. Farmers counted their losses in dead livestock and ruined crops. Charities warned that the relief provided during the frost was only temporary, and that many would struggle for months afterward. The winter of 1895 revealed how quickly food security could collapse, even in a powerful industrial nation. Britain's dependence on transport networks, vulnerable to snow and ice, left millions exposed when those systems failed. The experience underscored the precariousness of working-class life, where a few weeks of disrupted supply could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Hunger in the frost became one of the most haunting memories of that winter. It was not the picturesque snow or the frozen rivers that lingered in the minds of those who suffered, but the gnawing emptiness of the stomach, the sight of children crying for bread, and the humiliation of begging for a bowl of soup. The freeze turned hunger into a national ordeal, reminding Victorians that beneath the grandeur of empire lay a fragile foundation. The River Thames has always been more than water flowing through London. It has been the artery of trade, the stage of pageantry, and the boundary between districts of wealth and poverty. But in the winter of 1895, the Thames took on a different role. It became a symbol of both wonder and danger. For weeks, parts of Britain's greatest river froze solid, conjuring echoes of centuries past when Londoners held legendary frost fairs upon its icy surface by January. Temperatures had plunged so low and for so long that even the Thames, with its strong currents and tidal flow, began to seize up. At Oxford, the river froze across its width, drawing crowds of students and townspeople to skate and play. Further downstream, in stretches near Richmond, Kingston, and Hampton Court, the water stiffened into jagged sheets of ice. In London itself, the river did not freeze entirely from bank to bank, but large flows appeared, clumping together and locking sections into near stillness. Barges lay trapped, their hulls gripped by the ice, while smaller boats were abandoned on the banks. Newspapers greeted the spectacle with a mixture of awe and nostalgia. The Illustrated London News published engravings of men venturing onto the ice, while the Times reminded readers of the last great frost fair in 1814, when Londoners had set up stalls, roasted oxen, and printed souvenirs upon the frozen river. In 1895, hopes flickered that such a scene might return, but conditions were not quite the same. The construction of new embankments in the mid-19th century had narrowed and deepened the Thames, increasing its flow and reducing the likelihood of a solid freeze in central London, while upstream stretches froze firmly. The capital's heart never quite delivered a true frost fair. Still, the allure of the frozen Thames proved irresistible. Crowds gathered at Richmond, Windsor, and Oxford to watch daring skaters trace lines across the ice. Newspapers carried vivid reports of races and impromptu performances. At Windsor, local boys performed tricks before cheering spectators, while near Hampton Court, gentlemen in top hats attempted clumsy glides. Photographs captured these moments, preserving a rare image of Victorian leisure upon a frozen river dot, but the ice held dangers as well as delights. On January 24th, tragedy struck at Regent's Park, where the ornamental lake froze and drew hundreds of skaters. The ice gave way, plunging dozens into the water. At least 40 people drowned, their bodies pulled from the icy depths in full view of horrified crowds. The disaster made headlines across Britain, serving as a grim warning that no frozen surface could be trusted entirely. Although this tragedy did not occur on the Thames itself, it cast a shadow over all public skating. Authorities posted warnings and, in some cases, banned gatherings on unsafe stretches of the river. For working Londoners, the frozen Thames was not merely a spectacle but an obstacle. Bargemen, lightermen, and dock workers found themselves without employment as boats lay immobilized. Coal shipments to the capital slowed dramatically, as barges stranded at Brever could not pass through the ice. At Billingsgate, the great fish market struggled as fishing boats failed to deliver catches. One fishmonger complained to the Morning Leader that the Thames itself has swallowed our trade. The freeze on the river thus deepened the crises of food and fuel, already felt in the city. Elsewhere along the river's course, the freeze disrupted daily rhythms. Ferries could not cross, isolating riverside communities. Bridges became clogged with foot traffic as people who once relied on boats were forced to walk. In rural stretches, farmers accustomed to using the river for transport now watched helplessly as ice piled along its banks, damaging wharves and flooding fields during intermittent thaws. Yet alongside hardship, the frozen Thames inspired scenes of striking beauty. Artists sketched the river transformed into a silver plain, dotted with dark figures moving cautiously across its surface. In Oxford, the scene was described as a northern landscape in miniature, with punts frozen midstream and college towers gleaming against the snow. Writers drew comparisons with Dutch winter paintings, imagining themselves transplanted into a landscape of Bruegel or Averkamp. The freeze also brought reminders of history. Elderly Londoners recalled childhood tales of the frost fairs of the 18th and early 19th centuries. During the Great Freeze of 1683 to 84, entire markets had sprung up on the Thames, complete with printing presses, producing commemorative cards declaring printed on the River Thames. In 1814, an ox had been roasted on the ice near By 1895, such scenes belonged to legend, yet the frozen river rekindled public imagination. Articles in the Illustrated London News and Daily Chronicle revisited the history of the frost fairs, comparing past revelry with the more restrained gatherings of the present. Not all interactions with the ice were voluntary. Police and rescue crews reported numerous accidents along the riverbanks, where individuals attempting to cross thin ice fell through and drowned. Children chasing playthings, workers testing shortcuts, or opportunists scavenging along the edges all risked their lives. In one widely reported case, a group of boys in Lambeth attempted to walk across a frozen inlet, only for two to fall through and perish before rescuers could reach them. Such tragedies underscored the lethal reality beneath the picturesque facade. Despite the risks, the frozen Thames became a shared cultural moment. Poems were published in newspapers celebrating the ice. Street vendors sold prints and postcards of the scenes. The event became a talking point not only in Britain but abroad. Reports appeared in European and American papers, marveling that the great river of London had once again frozen as in centuries past. The freeze extended beyond the Thames. Canals across the Midlands and northern England froze solid, halting barge traffic vital to coal and industry. In Manchester, the Bridgewater Canal turned to ice, cutting off supplies. In Birmingham, the Birmingham and Fazeley Canal became a skating ground for local children. These frozen waterways reinforced the sense that Britain itself had been immobilized, its lifeblood congealed by relentless frost. By late February, the Thames began to thaw. The breakup of the ice brought new perils. Large floes drifted downstream, colliding with piers and barges. At times, the river carried great sheets of ice through central London, drawing crowds to the bridges to watch. The spectacle was described as both magnificent and menacing, jagged blocks grinding against one another with thunderous sound. The thaw also caused flooding in riverside areas, as water surged over banks already weakened by ice. When the river finally returned to its natural flow in March, Londoners looked back on the freeze as an event that belonged to both history and legend. The Thames had once again reminded the city of its power to awe, to delight, and to destroy. The winter of 1895 was remembered not only for its relentless cold, but for the transformation of the great river into a frozen emblem of endurance. In the years that followed, commentators noted that the freeze of 1895 might be the last of its kind. The embankments had altered the river's nature, and warming winters made such events rarer. They were correct. Though cold winters would return, the Thames would never again freeze in the same way. The spectacle of 1895 thus marked the end of an era, a fleeting reminder of older centuries when the river could be both a highway and a fairground. For those who lived through it, the memory of walking upon its frozen surface, of seeing barges trapped and bridges crowded with gawkers, lingered long after the thaw. The frozen Thames became a story passed down, a tale of beauty, hardship, and history colliding upon the water. The winter of 1895 was a trial for all of Britain, but for its youngest citizens, the ordeal was particularly cruel. Children of the Victorian age were already among the most vulnerable members of society, shaped by poverty, disease, and hard labor. When the Great Frost descended, their struggles deepened, turning the streets, schools, and homes of Britain into arenas of survival. Accounts from the time reveal how deeply the freeze affected childhood. In London, East End children lived in damp, overcrowded tenements where frosts spread across walls and windows. Philanthropist Charles Booth, who had studied the lives of the poor, noted that in some districts, families had neither fire nor food, with children sleeping in their clothes to stave off the cold. The Daily Chronicle described pale-faced boys and girls huddled together in stairwells, their breath visible in the frozen air of their homes. The cold left its mark on health. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza spread rapidly among children weakened by malnutrition. Medical reports from the period show a sharp rise in child mortality during January and February of 1895 in Manchester. Hospitals admitted dozens of children each week suffering from respiratory illness. In Liverpool, the city's medical officer noted a distressing increase in deaths of infants due to exposure, even in wealthier families. Doctors recorded cases of frostbite and hypothermia. Schools, which should have provided structure and shelter, often offered little relief. Many schoolrooms were inadequately heated, with coal in short supply or unaffordable for local authorities. Teachers wrote of pupils shivering at their desks, unable to concentrate on lessons. Attendance dropped sharply in poorer districts as children were kept at home, either too ill to attend or needed to fetch coal, water, or scraps of food for their families. In some cases, shoes were so worn that children could not walk to school across the snow and ice. Yet children were not only victims. They also became participants in the altered rhythms of life. The frozen streets became playgrounds, transformed into skating rinks and sledding runs. Newspaper illustrations show boys sliding along icy roads, laughing as they collided into one another, while others fashioned sleds from wooden boxes or pieces of scrap. The illustrated sporting and dramatic news remarked on the boisterous delight of children who turned hardship into play. Still, this play carried risks. The tragic drowning of dozens of young skaters when the ice gave way on the Serpentine in Regent's Park reminded families that the joy of skating could turn deadly. Reports from towns across Britain tell of similar accidents, children falling through ponds, canals, or rivers, sometimes rescued, often lost. Local papers carried grim headlines: "Boy drowned at Oldham," "Children swept beneath the ice in Glasgow." For working-class children, the freeze brought harsher responsibilities. Many were employed in street trades, selling matches, newspapers, or flowers. The cold made these tasks almost unbearable. Henry Mayhew's earlier surveys of child street sellers had already painted a grim picture, and though his work dated from the 1840s, conditions in 1895 were little improved. Boys with bare feet trudged through snow to sell papers whose headlines screamed of the frost. Girls offered wilted flowers from frozen baskets. Charitable workers described scenes of children crying with cold, yet unwilling to abandon their wares for fear of losing the day's pennies. Others labored in factories, workshops, and mines where the cold seeped into workplaces. In textile mills, windows frosted over while looms continued to clatter. In coal mines, the underground temperature offered some relief, but the journey to and from the pits through snowbound villages was arduous. For young apprentices and errant boys, Icy roads meant endless falls and bruises as they hurried to complete deliveries. Despite the suffering, children were often at the center of communal responses to the freeze. Charitable organizations directed much of their work toward feeding and clothing the young. The Salvation Army distributed hot meals specifically for children in London, while churches across Britain opened schools and parish halls as temporary shelters. Reports describe rows of children seated with tin mugs of broth, their faces red from the cold but lit with relief. Middle-class philanthropy also produced special initiatives. The Children's Country Holiday Fund, usually aimed at sending poor children to the countryside in summer, organized emergency distributions of clothing during the frost. Well-to-do families in districts like Kensington and Hampstead collected coats and boots to be sent to East End schools. Newspapers encouraged donations, reminding readers that the smallest gift may save a child's life in this bitter season. Even so, countless children endured hunger alongside cold. Diaries and inquests record heartbreaking cases. A girl in Birmingham who fainted from starvation at her desk. A boy in Leeds who died after weeks of living on bread crusts. A group of siblings in Glasgow discovered by relief workers huddled around a candle stub for warmth. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of deprivation that the frost magnified. The cultural response to the plight of children was telling. Newspapers frequently used images of suffering boys and girls to arouse sympathy and raise funds. Illustrations depicted wide-eyed children in rags against snowy backdrops, a powerful contrast to the romanticized visions of Victorian childhood popularized in literature. For reformers, the frieze provided a stark illustration of the failures of society to protect its most vulnerable. Not all stories were tragic. Some accounts highlight resilience and even moments of joy. In villages, children created games in the snow, built fortresses, and staged mock battles. In Oxford, university students joined local children on the frozen river, organizing races and lending skates. For a brief time, social boundaries blurred on the ice. Though hunger and poverty quickly reasserted themselves once the games ended, the winter also left a mark on memory. Adults who lived through it recalled decades later the extraordinary cold of their childhood in 1895. Oral histories collected in the early 20th century include vivid recollections. The frost patterns on windows, the long walks to fetch coal, the thrill of skating on frozen canals, the funerals of classmates who succumbed to illness. For many, the Great Frost was the defining winter of their youth. By March, when the thaw finally arrived, children were among the first to return to the rhythms of ordinary life. Schools reopened with full attendance, though weakened by illness and loss. Street sellers reappeared with new vigor as demand for goods returned. Yet the scars remained in the form of lost siblings, stunted growth from malnutrition, and memories of nights spent without heat. The children of the frost became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. Their suffering highlighted the inadequacies of Victorian social policy, while their endurance offered a reminder of the strength of the human spirit even in the harshest conditions. In the frozen empire of 1895, no image was more haunting or more compelling than that of the child shivering against the snow. The Great Frost of 1895 did not only freeze rivers, halt trains, and silent streets. It also drove people into the arms of faith. In a society where religion was still a cornerstone of daily life, churches became both spiritual refuges and practical sanctuaries during the months of bitter cold. The frost tested not only bodies, but beliefs. And in pulpits and parish halls across Britain, faith took on a new urgency. In Victorian Britain, church attendance was already a deeply ingrained rhythm. Sundays saw pews filled with families, and religious institutions played central roles in charity, education, and social order. But in the winter of 1895, attendance swelled not simply out of devotion, but out of necessity. Churches offered something few homes could guarantee: warmth. Coal fires burned in parish halls and vestries, drawing in the poor who had none at home. Families huddled together in wooden pews, not only to hear sermons, but to escape the biting wind that rattled through broken windows of their own dwellings. Reports from the Church Times described how London congregations grew noticeably larger during January and February in East End parishes where tenements were hardest hit by the frost. Vicars found themselves ministering to overflowing crowds. Parish halls were opened for hot meals and tea, often served by volunteers from wealthier districts. For many, these gatherings provided both physical relief and a sense of community at a time when isolation was deadly. Beyond warmth, the frost stirred theological reflection. Clergymen across denominations addressed the freeze in sermons, interpreting it as both a natural trial and a spiritual lesson. Some spoke of the frost as divine punishment, a call to moral reform in a society marked by inequality and sin. The Reverend Hugh Price Hughes, a prominent Methodist reformer, declared that the suffering of the poor in the frost was a rebuke to the conscience of the nation, urging the wealthy to recognize their duty of charity. Others framed the freeze as a test of endurance, likening it to biblical trials. The language of suffering, sacrifice, and redemption resonated strongly in the cold pews. At the same time, churches mobilized practical aid. Anglican parishes collected donations of coal, clothing, and food, distributing them to the needy through parish networks. Nonconformist chapels organized soup kitchens and relief drives, particularly in industrial towns. The Salvation Army, already a prominent presence in working-class neighborhoods, expanded its operations, opening night shelters where entire families could sleep in relative warmth. William Booth's followers saw the frost as an opportunity to demonstrate Christian charity in action, offering not only food and heat, but religious tracts and hymns. Faith communities outside Christianity also responded. Jewish congregations in London's East End, many composed of recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, organized their own relief funds to aid struggling families. Mutual aid societies within these communities emphasized solidarity, with wealthier members contributing to support those most affected. Reports from the Jewish Chronicle highlight how synagogues became central points for distributing food and clothing. During the frost, religion also shaped the cultural memory of the winter. Newspapers published accounts of outdoor processions through snow-covered streets, where parishioners carried candles and sang hymns despite freezing winds. These public displays of devotion, illuminated by flickering lights in the darkness, became powerful images of faith against adversity, but not all responses were solemn. The frost also brought moments of communal celebration within churches. In rural villages cut off by snowdrifts, congregations gathered for extended services, followed by communal meals in parish halls. For isolated communities, these gatherings offered rare opportunities for warmth, fellowship, and hope. The freeze also revived older traditions of interpreting weather as divine communication. Letters to newspapers included reflections that the extraordinary cold was a message from Providence, warning Britain against pride in its industrial achievements. Others suggested it was a reminder of the fragility of human life against the forces of nature. While scientists at the Meteorological Office measured temperatures and analyzed pressure systems, ordinary people sought meaning through scripture and sermon. Religious charity, however, could not meet every need. Reports from poorer parishes noted that resources were quickly overwhelmed. Vicars recorded turning away families when food supplies ran out. The Guardian observed that while churches were doing noble work, the scale of poverty was far beyond their capacity. These limits sparked debates about the role of the state versus the church in addressing suffering. Reformers argued that reliance on charity, however well, exposed systemic failures in Victorian society. Nevertheless, for individuals, the comfort of faith often made the difference between despair and endurance. Testimonies collected later reveal how hymns sung in freezing chapels lifted spirits. A woman from Southwark recalled decades later that the only hot meal she ate during a frost was served in her parish hall. For her, the memory of soup, bread, and hymns together defined that winter. The frost also shaped religious discourse beyond Britain. Missionary societies used reports of suffering to appeal for donations, linking the plight of Britain's poor to global Christian duty. In sermons printed and distributed abroad, the Great Frost became an example of how even the heart of the empire needed God's mercy. By March, when the thaw came, churches reflected on the lessons of the frost. Many sermons emphasized gratitude for survival and urged continued charity for those left impoverished by the crisis. Parish records show increases in membership and participation in the months following the freeze, suggesting that hardship had driven people closer to faith. The winter of 1895 demonstrated how deeply intertwined religion remained with daily life in late Victorian Britain. Churches were not only spiritual centers, but practical shelters. Sermons provided moral interpretation, while parish halls offered food and fire. Faith did not shield people from the cold, but it gave them meaning, comfort, and solidarity in the frozen empire. The Great Frost of 1895 was not only a test of endurance, it was also a test of knowledge. By the late Victorian age, Britain prided itself on progress. Railways spanned the country. Telegraph wires carried messages across continents, and medical science had made striking advances. Yet when the freeze descended, much of the population still relied on centuries-old remedies and improvised strategies to survive. The winter revealed both the achievements and the limitations of Victorian science in the face of nature's extremes. In 1895, the concept of hypothermia as a medical condition was only beginning to be understood. Doctors spoke instead of exposure or death from cold. The word hypothermia would not enter widespread use until the early 20th century. Still, medical officers recognized the symptoms: shivering, confusion, drowsiness, and eventual collapse. Hospital reports from London and Manchester describe patients admitted insensible, from cold, often after being found unconscious. In the streets or unheated homes, Victorian medicine had no specialized treatment beyond gradual warming. Patients were wrapped in blankets, rubbed with hot flannels, and given warm drinks if they could swallow. In some cases, doctors attempted to revive the near-dead with stimulants such as brandy or ammonia. Though primitive by modern standards, these methods occasionally succeeded. Survivors' accounts speak of awakening in hospital wards, surrounded by coal stoves and the clatter of nurses, grateful for a second chance. Frostbite was another frequent affliction. Doctors described cases of blackened extremities among laborers, beggars, and children. Medical journals debated the best treatment. Some advocated rapid warming in hot water, while others warned that this caused tissue damage. Amputations were not uncommon when gangrene set in. In Glasgow, surgeons recorded dozens of cases where fingers or toes had to be removed. For working men dependent on physical labor, such injuries could mean permanent loss of livelihood. The winter also sharpened awareness of the link between cold and respiratory illness. Pneumonia and bronchitis deaths rose sharply, especially among children and the elderly. Physicians knew that damp, unheated rooms were breeding grounds for disease, though the precise mechanisms of bacteria and viruses were still under study. Louis Pasteur's germ theory had been accepted by many in the medical profession, but public health measures lagged behind. Ventilation, once promoted as a call, seemed useless against the deadly chill. Ordinary people often turned to home remedies, passed down through generations. Herbal teas, mustard poultices, and camphor rubs were widely used to treat coughs and chills. Warm gin or brandy was consumed as both comfort and cure. Newspapers printed advice columns recommending simple methods: wrapping hot bricks in flannel for bed, placing onions in stockings to ward off illness, or rubbing chilblains with vinegar. Some remedies had mild effectiveness. Others were little more than superstition. The frost also put Victorian housing under scrutiny. Wealthier homes had fireplaces in every room, but even they suffered from poor insulation. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and drafts crept under doors. For the working poor in single-room dwellings, conditions were appalling. Studies by reformers such as Octavia Hill and Charles Booth had already revealed the inadequacy of housing for London's poor. The winter of 1895 made those inadequacies deadly. Walls leaked cold air, roofs sagged under snow, and floors were damp with frozen water. Efforts to improve insulation were minimal. Double glazing, commonplace today, was virtually unknown. Survival depended less on engineering than on piling bodies together under blankets. Clothing offered another line of defense. Middle and upper-class Victorians had access to thick wool, furs, and layered garments. The poor often had little more than rags, patched repeatedly until fabric disintegrated. Charities distributed coats, boots, and scarves, but demand far outstripped supply. Newspapers reported children walking barefoot in the snow, their feet wrapped in sacking. Medical officers noted the chilblains, painful inflammations caused by cold. Damp conditions were rampant among poorly clothed populations. Despite hardship, some Victorians experimented with new methods of heating and insulation. Gas heaters, though expensive and sometimes dangerous, were becoming available in wealthier homes. A few innovators attempted to improve stove designs or experimented with insulated bedding. In Manchester, inventors promoted patent warming devices in newspapers, advertising them as solutions to the frost. Most ordinary people, however, relied on coal fires, candles, and sheer endurance. The freeze also spurred scientific interest in weather. The Meteorological Office, established only 3 decades earlier, received intense scrutiny. Critics asked why such a severe winter had not been predicted. At the time, forecasting relied on barometers, telegraph reports, and the careful study of atmospheric patterns. Meteorologists recorded January 1895 as one of the coldest months in living memory, with average temperatures several degrees below normal. Their reports noted the persistence of high-pressure systems, blocking warmer Atlantic winds and allowing Arctic air to dominate Britain. for the public. Such explanations carried less weight than lived experience. People wrote to newspapers with their own theories, ranging from volcanic activity abroad to divine judgment at home. Amateur weather observers submitted temperature readings from their gardens, contributing to a growing culture of citizen science. The winter highlighted both the progress and the limitations of meteorology in an age when predicting long-term cold was still beyond reach. Survival was not purely scientific, it was also social. Communities shared strategies for enduring the cold. Neighbors pooled coal, exchanged blankets, or took turns watching over children while parents worked. Families moved into single rooms to conserve heat, bodies pressed together for warmth. Churches and charities taught basic methods of protection, stuffing rags into window cracks, hanging blankets across doors, or heating bricks to place in beds. These practices, though simple, saved lives. In rural areas, survival often depended on ingenuity. Farmers insulated livestock shelters with straw, dug through snow to find grazing, or slaughtered animals early to provide food. Villagers cut ice holes in frozen rivers to fetch water. Oral histories recall families placing straw on floors to reduce damp and cold. These methods reflected centuries of practical knowledge, rooted less in science than in necessity. The frost also exposed the limits of Victorian optimism about progress. In an age of telegraphs, steamships, and electricity, many assumed that science had conquered nature. The paralysis of 1895 proved otherwise. Trains stopped, pipes burst, and factories closed. Disease spread unchecked. The scientific and technological advances of the 19th century offered little comfort when homes froze and food disappeared. The experience humbled a nation that prided itself on mastery of its environment. Yet the frost also accelerated conversations about reform. Medical officers used statistics from the winter to argue for better housing, improved public health measures, and greater investment in social welfare. Engineers considered new methods of heating and insulation. Meteorologists called for expanded observation networks to better understand extreme weather. Though change was slow, the lessons of 1895 planted seeds that would influence future debates. For individuals, however, survival was rarely about science or policy. It was about enduring one more night, finding one more scrap of fuel, or keeping one more child alive. Diaries from the period reveal how people measured their lives in small victories: a fire that lasted until morning, a loaf of bread secured despite shortages, a neighbor revived after collapsing in the snow. These human strategies, born of desperation and resourcefulness, were the true science of survival in a frozen empire. By the time the thaw arrived in March, the Great Frost had claimed thousands of lives. Some died from exposure, others from disease, many from the compounded effects of hunger, cold, and poverty. The medical profession recorded the data. Scientists debated the causes, and reformers demanded change. But for those who endured it, the memory of the frost was not a matter of statistics or theories. It was the memory of shivering bodies, smoky fires, and the relentless struggle to stay alive. The winter of 1895 demonstrated both the reach and the limits of Victorian knowledge. Science could measure the cold, describe its effects, and propose remedies, but it could not shield people from its grasp. In the end, survival depended less on innovation than on endurance, the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary cold. The winter of 1895 laid bare the sharp contrasts of Victorian Britain. While the poor shivered in tenements and children scavenged for scraps, The wealthy endured the frost in fur-lined comfort. For the aristocracy and the upper middle classes, the great frost was less a struggle for survival and more an inconvenience, one that often became an opportunity for display. In their drawing rooms, country estates, and exclusive clubs, the frost was experienced in ways unrecognizable to those on the streets. Newspapers of the time documented the disparity. The Morning Post, a paper with a readership firmly rooted in the upper classes, ran society columns that mentioned frozen carriages and disrupted dinner parties, but little about starvation or disease. The frost, for London's elite, was a backdrop to the season's social calendar. Even as coal prices doubled, the wealthy could afford abundant supplies. Their townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia boasted roaring fires in multiple rooms, with servants ensuring that grates never went cold. Furs became the most visible symbol of privilege. Shops along Regent Street and Bond Street displayed Russian sables, Canadian lynx, and silver fox, imported at great cost for customers who prized luxury as much as warmth. Fashion magazines of January 1895 showcased ladies wrapped in voluminous cloaks, muffs, and stoles, praising the elegance of their attire. For the working poor, whose children lacked shoes, the sight of aristocrats stepping from carriages in gleaming furs was a bitter reminder of inequality. Country estates offered even greater insulation from the frost. The aristocracy, with their vast resources, continued to host winter gatherings. Diaries from families such as the Duke of Marlborough's at Blenheim Palace mention grand dinners and house parties where fires blazed in cavernous halls. Guests arrived wrapped in furs, their carriages struggling along icy drives, only to enter palatial interiors where dozens of fireplaces glowed. Servants toiled in freezing outbuildings and kitchens to keep their masters comfortable, often suffering more from the cold than those they served. Hunting, a favored winter pastime of the aristocracy, was disrupted but not abandoned. Reports from estates in Yorkshire and Norfolk describe hunts proceeding despite the snow, with riders bundled in furs and horses shod with special shoes for icy ground. The illustrated sporting and dramatic news printed images of these hunts, portraying them as heroic and picturesque. To the wealthy, the frost could even heighten the thrill of sport, turning familiar landscapes into challenging terrain. In London, exclusive clubs such as the Athenaeum and the Reform Club remained warm sanctuaries. Their coal supplies were secure and their kitchens well stocked. Gentlemen gathered by polished hearths to discuss politics, finance, and the peculiarities of the season. The inconvenience of delayed trains or cancelled events was softened by brandy, cigars, and conversation. To outsiders, the comfort of these clubs contrasted starkly with the hardship visible only a few streets away. Theatres and concert halls, frequented by the affluent, also adapted. Although audiences sometimes struggled to arrive through icy streets, performances continued. The Royal Opera House in Covent Garden staged productions despite the frost, its interior heated by coal furnaces. Reviews and society papers made passing mention of the cold but focused on the brilliance of the performers and the gowns of the audience. For those who could afford tickets, the frost was a setting for culture. Not a barrier to it travel, however, posed challenges even for the wealthy. Carriages slipped on icy streets, and trains were delayed by snow. Letters from aristocratic families mention cancelled visits and postponed journeys to country estates. Yet these inconveniences were softened by alternatives. Those stranded at stations could afford to wait in first-class lounges or to hire private carriages once lines reopened. Unlike the poor, whose livelihoods collapsed with transport delays. The wealthy lost little more than patience. Some among the aristocracy turned their attention to charity. The frost inspired notable acts of philanthropy, often reported in society columns. The Duchess of Marlborough organised coal and blanket distributions in Oxfordshire. Lady Burdecoats, a renowned philanthropist, contributed generously to relief funds. The Lord Mayor's Mansion House Fund, which raised thousands for food and fuel, drew heavily on donations from wealthy Londoners. These contributions were genuine, but they also reinforced social hierarchies, the wealthy as benefactors, the poor as recipients. Critics observed the contradictions. Reformers like Beatrice Webb and Charles Booth noted how charity, however well-intentioned, did not address structural inequality. The frost, they argued, revealed how the comforts of the few were secured at the expense of the many. Webb wrote in her diary that the East End froze while the West endures in fur, a phrase that captured the moral divide of the season. The cultural response to the aristocracy's endurance was mixed. Some admired their ability to maintain traditions of elegance and hospitality despite the frost. Society magazines framed their lavish balls and dinners as symbols of resilience, portraying Britain's elite as unshaken by adversity. Others, particularly in reformist and working-class newspapers, condemned their extravagance as callous indifference. The juxtaposition of banquets and soup kitchens, of fur-lined cloaks and barefoot children, became a theme in public discourse. Yet it would be misleading to suggest that the wealthy were untouched entirely. Letters from country estates record frozen pipes, collapsed roofs under snow, and disrupted routines. Servants sometimes failed to arrive, leaving households short-staffed. Even the grandest mansions could feel the sting of the frost when fires died or supply routes faltered. But these were inconveniences, not existential threats. The aristocracy had resources to adapt, from ordering extra coal to relocating temporarily. In many ways, the frost reinforced their social identity. The ability to host glittering gatherings while the nation suffered became a demonstration of power. Furs, fires, and feasts were not only comforts, but statements. That privilege endured even against nature's worst. For some, this display of resilience enhanced prestige. For others, it deepened resentment. By the time the thaw came in March, the memory of the frost among the aristocracy was one of discomfort rather than disaster. Diaries recalled postponed hunts, delayed dinners, and the spectacle of frozen rivers, but rarely starvation or death. In contrast, the same winter etched itself into the lives of the poor as a season of loss. This divergence of memory reinforced the social divide. The Great Frost of 1895, thus, became another chapter in the history of Victorian inequality. While the nation as a whole endured weeks of ice, the experiences of its people were profoundly shaped by class. For the poor, the frost was a fight for survival. For the wealthy, it was endured in fur. If the aristocracy faced the winter of 1895 wrapped in furs, Britain's labourers and paupers endured it in smoke-filled mills and freezing workhouses. The Great Frost exposed not only the fragility of homes and streets, but also the vulnerabilities of the nation's workplaces and its institutions of last resort, factories. Already harsh environments grew brutal in the prolonged cold. Britain's industrial might depended on mills, foundries, and workshops. Yet many of these buildings were vast, drafty spaces with little heating. Workers in Lancashire cotton mills described condensation from their breath freezing on machinery. In Birmingham's metal workshops, hammers rang against iron in rooms so cold that workers wrapped rags around their hands to hold tools. Newspaper correspondents who toured factories in January reported that the machinery is as relentless as the frost, demanding labor while men's very bones are chilled. Employers rarely provided heating. Coal was expensive, and profits came first. Instead, workers layered on clothing, lit candles against the gloom, and endured. Accidents rose as cold stiffened fingers slipped on levers and spindles. Medical officers recorded an increase in workplace injuries during the frost, attributing many to impaired movement caused by the cold. In textile mills, humidity usually maintained to keep threads from snapping dropped drastically, leaving workers in clouds of dust that worsened respiratory ailments. The cold compounded the misery of long hours. In the Black Country, miners trudged 2 pits through snowbound villages, their boots caked in ice. Underground, the temperature was warmer, but the journey there was punishing. Quarrymen, brickmakers, and dockers labored in open air, fully exposed to the elements. Diaries from laborers mention fingers splitting, faces raw with wind, and exhaustion after hauling coal or stone in sub-zero weather. For them, the frost was not only endured but worked through, day after day. When work failed, there remained the workhouse. By 1895, the poor law system had already become infamous. Workhouses were intended as deterrents, offering relief only in exchange for confinement and labor. For thousands during the Great Frost, however, they became the last refuge against starvation and exposure. Reports from January show workhouses across the country filled beyond capacity. In London, the Whitechapel Union Workhouse turned away applicants when wards overflowed. The East London Observer described queues of destitute men, women and children pressing against the gates, their breaths rising in the icy night. In Manchester, officials converted extra rooms to accommodate the influx, but even then, hundreds slept on bare floors. Inside, conditions were grim. Heating was minimal, with fires rationed to save coal. Inmates often slept 2 to a bed or lay on thin straw pallets. Food consisted of bread, gruel, and occasional meat, monotonous fare, but at least consistent. For many, it was preferable to starvation outside. Yet the stigma of the workhouse weighed heavily. Entering its gates meant surrendering autonomy and accepting harsh discipline. Families were separated. Men, women, and children lived in different wards. The frost forced many to choose between freezing independence and humiliating relief. Newspapers carried stories of those who resisted. In Birmingham, one family reportedly refused the workhouse, preferring to endure in their unheated lodging rather than be split apart. Others, desperate, petitioned boards of guardians for outdoor relief, assistance in the form of food, coal, or money without confinement. Though officially restricted, some guardians relented under the pressure of public sympathy. Charities supplemented this with distributed rations, but the sheer scale of need overwhelmed them. Workhouse mortality rose during the frost. Medical officers recorded outbreaks of influenza and pneumonia sweeping through crowded wards. In some districts, burial registers noted sharp increases in deaths of inmates during January and February. The Leeds Mercury ran a chilling headline, "Cold and Hunger in the Union House." For children in the workhouse, the frost compounded existing hardships. Already subject to strict regimens of schooling and labor, they now endured unheated classrooms and frigid dormitories. Charitable inspectors wrote of children with chilblains, so severe they could not hold pence. The diet, never abundant, felt meagre against the demands of the cold. Yet photographs from the period show small attempts at cheer. Children wrapped in donated coats, assembled in groups to sing hymns or recite lessons, their breath visible in the air. Factory inspectors and social reformers used the frost to highlight systemic failures. They argued that both industrial working conditions and poor law institutions were inadequate against extreme weather. Beatrice Webb, already a fierce critic of the workhouse system, noted in her diaries that the frost shows us not simply nature's cruelty, but society's indifference. Her words captured a growing sentiment that suffering was less the result of weather than of neglect. In Parliament, debates touched on the plight of workers and paupers, but responses were limited. The government hesitated to intervene directly, citing the dangers of undermining the poor law. Instead, officials emphasized voluntary charity and local discretion. Critics condemned this approach, insisting that national policy had failed the most vulnerable. The frost thus intensified broader debates about social reform at the close of the century. Yet within factories and workhouses, survival continued in small ways. Workers shared flasks of tea and bread during breaks, warming themselves around improvised braziers. Inmates huddled together for warmth, sang hymns to raise spirits, or carved small tokens from wood and bone. These acts of resilience, though humble, were vital. They kept despair at bay in places where the frost's grip felt unrelenting. The thaw in March brought little immediate relief. Factories resumed full production, but many workers returned weakened by illness or injury. Workhouses remained crowded, their inmates left with no prospects once released. The frost had not broken the industrial system or the poor law, but it had revealed their human cost with brutal clarity. For those who labored in mills, mines, and docks, or who endured confinement in freezing wards, the memory of 1895 was not of picturesque ice or aristocratic banquets. It was the memory of aching hands, unheated dormitories, and the relentless demand to work or submit even as the world outside froze solid. The Great Frost had turned factories and workhouses into theaters of endurance, places where survival was won not through comfort, but through sheer necessity. The Great Frost of 1895 claimed thousands of lives. Cold, hunger, and disease pressed heavily on Britain's poorest citizens, while even the well-to-do felt the bite of pneumonia and influenza. But the suffering did not end with death. The frost extended its grip into the rituals of mourning, transforming funerals into ordeals and exposing once more the social divides of the Victorian world. Cemeteries across Britain struggled to cope. Grave digging in frozen ground became a back-breaking task. Reports from January describe gravediggers hacking at earth as hard as stone, sometimes resorting to pickaxes and crowbars to break through permafrost. In rural parishes, vicars wrote of funerals delayed because graves could not be prepared in time. The Yorkshire Post reported that in some villages, burials were postponed for days, with coffins stored in church crypts until the soil could be penetrated in cities. The scale of death overwhelmed burial grounds. London's great cemeteries, Kensal Green, Brompton, Highgate, saw processions arriving daily, often several at once. Yet workers faced the same frozen soil as their rural counterparts. Accounts from Kensal Green mention graves dug shallow, covered with mounds of snow, simply to allow families some closure. Later, when the thaw arrived, many of these graves had to be deepened properly. The cost of funerals weighed heavily on working-class families. Even in ordinary times, Victorian funerals were expensive, with traditions of mourning dress, processions, and burial fees stretching household budgets. During the frost, when deaths multiplied, families faced ruinous expenses. The Manchester Guardian reported cases of families pawning their last possessions to afford a coffin. Others relied on burial clubs, mutual aid societies that collected small weekly fees to cover funeral costs. Yet the frost pushed many beyond even these supports. Some paupers' funerals were paid for entirely by parish funds, stripped of ceremony, with coffins carried on carts and lowered into common graves. The imagery of the frost seeped into descriptions of these funerals. Journalists noted mourners trudging through snow, black clothes stark against white landscapes. Carriages slid on icy streets, horses struggling to pull hearses through drifts. One report from Liverpool described a procession halted mid-route, when wheels froze fast in rutted snow, mourners forced to walk the rest of the way. The harshness of the weather deepened the grief of families, already broken by loss. Religious ceremonies adapted as best they could. Churches conducted multiple funerals in a single day, their aisles filled with mourners shivering in unheated pews. Vicars shortened services, aware that lingering too long in icy air risked illness. Graveside prayers were often rushed, spoken quickly as clergymen and families stood in biting winds. The solemnity of ritual was cut short by necessity. Grief had to compete with survival. Yet even amid hardship, Victorian mourning customs persisted. Families still sought mourning clothes, even if in the humblest form. Draped windows, black crepe armbands, and simple veils appeared in poor districts. Symbols of dignity maintained despite poverty. For the wealthy, mourning remained elaborate. The frost did not halt the ordering of custom coffins, the wearing of fine black silks, or the holding of receptions in heated drawing rooms. The contrast between classes extended even into death. Workhouses and hospitals conducted their own grim funerals. Inmates who died during the frost were often buried in mass graves, with only the simplest rites. Contemporary observers condemned these scenes as degrading, yet they were common. The Pall Mall Gazette carried a report of dozens of pauper coffins lowered together into a single trench. The earth so frozen that the spade rang upon it like iron. Such burials underscored the stark reality, even in death. The poor remained bound by the limits of their station. The frost also disrupted the supply of materials. Coffin makers struggled as wood became scarce and transport slowed. In some towns, coffins were reused temporarily. The deceased carried 2 graves in communal shells before being lowered in cheaper boxes. Newspaper advertisements from January 1895 show undertakers appealing for advance payments, warning that shortages were affecting their trade. Death had become not only a family tragedy, but a logistical crisis. For many families, the emotional toll was worsened by isolation. Snowbound villages often held funerals with only a handful of mourners, as travel was impossible. In one case, reported from Northumberland, a child was buried with only her parents present, no relatives able to cross frozen roads. Such scenes broke the Victorian ideal of communal mourning, replacing it with private sorrow amid a silent, frozen countryside. Yet funerals also became moments of solidarity. In working-class districts, neighbors often contributed pennies to ensure a proper burial for the deceased. Communities gathered for processions, braving the cold together. The act of walking side by side through snow-covered streets, bearing their dead to the grave, offered both dignity and defiance. Death, even multiplied by frost, would not erase tradition. The scale of mortality also entered public discourse. Weekly death returns, published in newspapers, listed hundreds of deaths attributed to exposure and diseases of the respiratory organs. Readers scanned the columns, seeing familiar surnames or entire streets afflicted. The statistics turned the frost into a collective experience of mourning, a season not only of cold but of constant funerals. The cultural impact was profound. Later recollections of the frost often centered not on play in the snow or skating on rivers, but on the endless funerals. Oral histories gathered decades later include memories of the black lines of mourners and the ground so hard it seemed to reject the dead. These images lingered, shaping how the winter was remembered long after the thaw. For reformers, the funerals highlighted inequality as starkly as hunger and housing. They pointed to the indignities of pauper burials, contrasting them with the lavish ceremonies of the wealthy. In doing so, they reinforced arguments for social reform, insisting that dignity in death should not be determined by wealth. The frost had exposed not only the vulnerabilities of the living, but also the inequities of mourning the dead. By March, as the ground softened and the backlog of burials eased, the rituals of mourning returned to more familiar rhythms. Yet the memory of frozen funerals remained. Families remembered coffins lowered into shallow graves, processions halted by snow, and prayers spoken in haste. The great frost had marked even death itself, turning Victorian funerals into scenes of endurance. In a society obsessed with ritual and memory, this mattered deeply. To the Victorians, how one was buried shaped how one was remembered. The frost had stripped many of that dignity, replacing it with images of hardship, haste, and cold. For Britain, the winter of 1895 was not only a season of hunger and frostbite, but a season when death itself seemed to freeze in place. The Great Frost of 1895 was not only a British ordeal. Its icy reach extended far beyond London's tenements and Yorkshire fields. Across Europe and the wider world, the same weather systems brought hardship, hunger, and death. For Britain, the heart of a global empire, the frost became both a domestic crisis and an international reminder that even the most powerful nation could not escape nature's grip. Meteorological reports from the period show that January and February 1895 were among the coldest months recorded across the Northern Hemisphere. Arctic air swept southward in relentless waves, plunging much of Europe into deep freeze. Newspapers in France, Germany, and the Low Countries carried stories eerily similar to those in Britain. Frozen rivers, stalled trains, starving livestock, and mounting deaths. The Seine in Paris crusted with ice, halting barge traffic. The canals of Amsterdam froze solid, drawing crowds of skaters. In Berlin, the River Spree became a frozen highway, even as coal shortages left families shivering. In Russia, already accustomed to harsh winters, the season was brutal even by their standards. Peasant communities reported livestock losses and crop failures, while urban centers like St. Petersburg endured shortages of fuel and food. For Eastern Europe's poor, the frost exacerbated already precarious conditions. Letters from British diplomats in Warsaw and Budapest warned of unrest as food prices spiked and protests broke out. Transatlantic reports revealed that the freeze touched North America as well. New York newspapers described blizzards sweeping the Northeast, with rivers frozen and railroads paralyzed. In Chicago, temperatures plunged to record lows. The winter was remembered as one of the hardest of the decade, with similar consequences: food shortages, industrial disruption, and hardship for the poor. For Britain, the frost's global reach had direct consequences. The empire's food and fuel supplies depended on international trade. Grain from North America, meat from Argentina, and wool from Australia all faced delays as ports iced over and ships struggled with frozen seas. At Liverpool, where ships unloaded goods from across the world, harbour authorities reported ice forming along the Mersey, disrupting schedules. Insurance claims rose as vessels reported damage from ice flows in the North Atlantic. Telegraph lines, the empire's arteries of communication, carried stories of the frost to and from distant colonies. Newspapers in India reported on Britain's plight with fascination, contrasting it with the heat of the subcontinent. The Times of India noted in February that England, mistress of seas and markets, finds herself at the mercy of a cold more relentless than any foe. In Canada, where winters were long and harsh, reports compared Britain's crisis to their own annual trials, offering sympathy but also a touch of irony at the mother country's struggle. The frost also exposed tensions in imperial governance. Colonial officials debated whether Britain's vulnerability undermined its image of strength. If the empire could not feed and heat its own citizens, how could it claim to bring stability to distant lands? Reformers seized on this irony, pointing out that the wealth of empire flowed through London, yet its poorest people starved in the frost. The moral authority of Britain's global mission, they argued, was compromised by the scenes in Whitechapel and Glasgow. At the same time, the frost became a unifying narrative. Newspapers spoke of an empire shivering together, linking the experiences of London, Paris, New York, and Berlin. The sense of a shared natural disaster fostered a strange solidarity across borders. Illustrations in the Illustrated London News placed images of skating in Amsterdam alongside frozen barges in Oxford, reminding readers that Britain was not alone. For Britain's global trading class, the frost offered lessons in vulnerability. Merchants recognized that supply lines were fragile when nature intervened. Business journals published analyses of delayed shipments, urging diversification of routes and reserves. Insurance firms recalculated risks, raising premiums for winter crossings. The frost of 1895 thus entered not only cultural memory but also economic planning. Scientific institutions across Europe collaborated to study the freeze. The Royal Meteorological Society in London exchanged data with counterparts in Paris and Berlin, comparing temperature records and atmospheric charts. The event spurred interest in long-term climate cycles, with some speculating about links to solar activity. Though the science was in its infancy, the frost became a case study for understanding extreme weather. Beyond science and trade, the frost had a symbolic dimension. In the imagination of Victorians, Britain's empire was built on mastery of seas, markets, and nature itself. The Great Frost cracked that image. It showed that no matter how vast the empire, its people remained subject to forces beyond their control. The frozen Thames, the starving families, the halted ships, all stood as reminders that even in the age of steam and telegraphs, winter could still humble an empire. When the thaw came in March, reflections on the frost were published not only in British papers but in journals across Europe and America. Some treated it as a historical oddity, others as a warning. Reformers continued to emphasize its lessons about poverty and inequality. Scientists debated its causes. Merchants recalculated risks. And ordinary people from London to Berlin to New York, remembered the bitter cold that bound them together for weeks in a shared ordeal. For Britain, the frost's imperial resonance lingered. It became a reference point in discussions of resilience, vulnerability, and reform. Later generations would look back on 1895 as the last great winter of the century, a season when the empire shivered alongside the world. By March of 1895, after weeks of relentless frost, Britain finally began to thaw. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. A thin trickle of water beneath the ice on rivers, the softening of snow-packed streets, the return of dripping eaves. Then, in a matter of days, the frozen empire seemed to dissolve. The transformation brought both relief and danger, as communities across the nation emerged from one ordeal only to face another. The thaw released rivers that had been locked in ice for weeks. On the Thames, jagged flows broke apart and drifted downstream, colliding with bridge piers and moored barges. Crowds gathered on bridges to watch the spectacle, marveling at the grinding ice sheets that carried branches, refuse, and sometimes whole boats with them. The Illustrated London News printed engravings of the moving icebergs of the Thames, portraying them as both magnificent and menacing. Flooding soon followed. In Richmond, Kingston, and parts of Oxford, waters spilled over weakened banks, inundating homes and warehouses. Farmers in low-lying areas saw their fields transformed into temporary lakes, undoing the little agricultural recovery they had hoped for in the north. The Ouse and the Tyne flooded towns already battered by the frost. The Yorkshire Herald reported villages where cottages stood waist-deep in icy water, residents forced to flee with what belongings they could carry. For families who had endured weeks of hunger and cold, the flood was a cruel sequel. The thaw, meant to signal relief, brought new displacement and loss. Urban centres also struggled. Snow and ice that had piled in streets now melted into thick, filthy slush. London's thoroughfares became rivers of mud, mixed with refuse that had lain buried for weeks. The sanitation crisis deepened. Blocked drains overflowed, carrying waste into roads and alleys. Medical officers warned of outbreaks of typhoid and cholera, diseases long associated with poor sanitation. Though the feared epidemics did not reach catastrophic proportions, mortality from infectious disease remained elevated through the spring. Economic life resumed, but not without scars. Factories reopened at full capacity, yet many workers returned weakened by illness or malnutrition. Employers noted drops in productivity, with absenteeism still high. In agriculture, losses were devastating. Farmers counted dead livestock by the thousands, ruined crops in the tens of thousands. The agricultural press of March and April was filled with reports of bankruptcies, auctions of stock, and appeals for government relief. For small farmers and crofters, the thaw revealed not recovery but ruin. Railways and canals cleared gradually, but the backlog of goods was immense. Coal deliveries resumed, but prices remained high for weeks, deepening hardship for families who had already spent their savings on survival. Food markets began to refill, yet shortages lingered. Bakers still rationed bread, and butchers' stalls were bare in poorer districts. For urban households, normal supply chains returned slowly, and resentment grew toward. Authorities perceived to have done too little during the frost. Charities and relief organizations shifted focus. Soup kitchens began to close, replaced by programs distributing clothing and money to help families rebuild. The Mansion House Fund continued to provide aid, but its resources were stretched thin. Inspectors visiting East End families in March reported rooms stripped of furniture, clothing sold or pawned, and households unable to pay rent. Poverty had deepened, and the thaw did not erase it. Politically, the frost and its aftermath sparked renewed debates. In Parliament, members discussed the inadequacy of the poor law system, the strain on workhouses, and the need for better housing. Reformers such as Beatrice Webb argued that the crisis revealed structural failures, not temporary misfortune. The government resisted sweeping changes, but the frost remained a reference point in arguments for social reform in the years ahead. Culturally, the thaw brought reflection. Newspapers published retrospectives, summarizing the toll in deaths, economic losses, and acts of heroism. The Daily Chronicle ran a series titled Lessons of the Frost, highlighting both the resilience of ordinary people and the failures of institutions. Illustrated papers produced engravings of frozen rivers, snowbound trains, and soup kitchens, cementing the frost in visual memory. For many Victorians, the images of 1895 became synonymous with suffering, and endurance. Personal accounts preserved the emotional weight of the thaw. Diaries from Londoners record the relief of hearing water drip from eaves, of seeing children splash in puddles instead of shiver in snow. Farmers wrote of the heartbreak of surveying drowned fields and dead stock. Clergymen described funerals conducted in thawing cemeteries, where muddy graves replaced frozen earth. For some, the thaw symbolized hope. For others, it was merely the next chapter in hardship. The psychological scars were deep. Families who had pawned possessions to survive emerged impoverished. Children weakened by hunger and illness carried lasting health problems. Communities remembered the losses in funerals and absences that would mark them for years. The frost had not only frozen the nation, but reshaped its memory of what winter could mean in the empire's cultural imagination. The thaw became a metaphor. Sermons spoke of renewal after trial, of suffering giving way to endurance. Reformers invoked the frost as evidence of Britain's need to modernize housing, sanitation, and welfare. Scientists used it as a case study in extreme weather. For ordinary people, it became a story passed down, of a winter when Britain froze solid, and of a thaw that revealed as much ruin as relief. By late spring, fields greened again, rivers ran free, and life resumed familiar rhythms. But the memory of 1895 endured. It was remembered not only as a season of snow and ice, but as a season when death multiplied, when poverty deepened, and when survival itself became a daily struggle. The thaw ended the immediate crisis, but its aftermath lingered in debts, illnesses, and reforms still debated years later. The Great Frost of 1895 had passed, but it had left behind a nation changed. When the ice melted and Britain returned to the rhythms of spring, the Great Frost of 1895 slipped from daily headlines. But it did not fade from memory. The winter etched itself into diaries, photographs, songs, and stories, becoming a shared experience that shaped how Victorians remembered hardship, resilience, and the fragility of modern life. For those who lived through it, memory was visceral. Adults later recalled the frost not as a picturesque season, but as a time of hunger, cold, and loss. Oral histories recorded in the early 20th century are filled with recollections of icy pains, queues outside soup kitchens, and funerals in snow. Many who had been children at the time described it as the defining winter of their youth. In working-class districts, memories centered on suffering, chilblains fainting in schools, siblings lost to pneumonia. Among the middle classes, Recollections were tinged with inconvenience rather than survival. Frozen pipes, delayed trains, cancelled events. The frost had not been experienced equally, and neither were its memories. Newspapers helped cement a cultural narrative. Retrospectives published in the years that followed often portrayed the frost as both extraordinary and emblematic. Illustrations of frozen rivers and ice-clad streets became iconic, reproduced in almanacs and books. Some depictions romanticized the frost, showing children skating or families gathered by fires. Others emphasized hardship, with engravings of soup lines and workhouse queues. The dual imagery, wonder and suffering, defined how the winter was remembered. Literature and popular culture absorbed the frost into broader themes. Sermons of the time framed it as divine chastisement, a lesson in humility for an empire grown proud. Reformers used it as a rhetorical tool, reminding audiences that the poor froze while the rich dined in fur. Poets described the silence of frozen landscapes, the sound of ice cracking on rivers, and the struggle for warmth in city alleys. The frost became more than weather. It became a metaphor for inequality, endurance, and the brittleness of modern progress. Photography gave the frost a permanence that earlier winters lacked. Images of the frozen Thames, children skating in Regent's Park, and long queues at soup kitchens circulated widely. They offered visual proof of the severity of 1895, shaping memory through stark contrast. The photographs of gaunt faces, fur-wrapped aristocrats, and stranded barges became part of Britain's visual archive, consulted in later decades as evidence of what winter could bring. The frost also entered the realm of statistics. Medical officers and government officials compiled tables of deaths, illnesses, and economic losses. These figures, published in reports, reinforced the frost as a historical marker. The thousands dead from pneumonia, the livestock lost, the tons of coal consumed, all became part of the official record. For historians and reformers alike, the numbers told a story as powerful as any engraving. Memory, however, was uneven. In rural communities, the frost was remembered through its impact on farming, ruined crops, dead sheep, barns collapsed under snow. In urban areas, it was remembered as a crisis of food and coal, of soup kitchens and funerals. For some, the frost became part of family lore, a story grandparents told to younger generations, a measure of hardship against which later winters were judged. In wealthier families, by contrast, it was recalled with a certain detachment, as an unusual season but not a defining trial. The Great Frost of 1895 also took on a place in the longer narrative of Britain's climate history. It was remembered alongside earlier great freezes, such as 1814, when the last frost fair was held on the Thames, and 1740, when famine swept Ireland and Scotland. By the early 20th century, it was often described as the last great frost, a relic of an older climate that seemed less likely to return. In an age of warming winters, the event became almost legendary. Reformers kept its memory alive for political purposes. Beatrice Webb and other social critics invoked the frost in debates about poverty, housing, and public health. They argued that the suffering of 1895 had been avoidable, a product of neglect rather than nature. Charities, too, used the frost in appeals for donations, reminding supporters of the misery that cold could bring. In this way, memory was harnessed for change, though the pace of reform remained slow. Yet memory also softened with time. By the Edwardian period, some accounts began to treat the frost with nostalgia, recalling sleigh rides in Hyde Park or skating on frozen ponds. Illustrated magazines published winter memories that leaned on the picturesque. The harsher realities of hunger and death receded in these accounts, replaced by sentimental images of snow. The frost, like many historical traumas, was gradually filtered through selective memory. The international dimension of memory was striking as well. In Paris, Berlin, and New York, the frost was remembered as part of a wider winter that united nations in suffering. Reports from 1895 remained in archives, occasionally revived in discussions of climate and weather. For Britain, the knowledge that other nations had endured similar hardship tempered the sense of isolation. The frost became part of a global memory of the 1890s. By the mid-20th century, the frost of 1895 had largely passed from living memory, but it remained in historical accounts as a marker of extremity. Historians writing about Victorian poverty cited it as a turning point in debates about welfare. Climate historians used it as evidence of natural variability. Local histories preserved stories of frozen rivers, lost livestock, and community relief efforts. In this way, the frost lived on, not as an immediate experience, but as a remembered moment in the story of Britain. Ultimately, the memory of the Great Frost was layered. For the poor, it was a scar. For reformers, it was a lesson. For the wealthy, it was an anecdote. And for the nation as a whole, it was a reminder that even at the height of empire, Britain was vulnerable. The frost of 1895 became part of the empire's memory not simply because of the cold, but because of what it revealed about society, inequality, and endurance. The Great Frost of 1895 did not last beyond a few months, but its legacy endured long after the ice had melted. For Victorians, it became a touchstone, a season remembered in newspapers, diaries, and political debates, a reminder of the fragility of progress, and a warning that even the strongest empire was not immune to the forces of nature. Its consequences reached into economics, social reform, public health, and cultural memory, shaping Britain in ways that extended well into the 20th century. One of the most immediate legacies was economic. The frost devastated agriculture, killing livestock, ruining winter crops, and delaying spring sowing. Farmers who had barely survived decades of competition from imported grain found themselves bankrupt. Agricultural historians note that the frost accelerated rural depopulation as families abandoned farms and sought work in towns. For Britain, already transitioning from an agricultural to an industrial economy, the frost hastened change. It underscored the vulnerability of rural livelihoods and pushed policymakers to reconsider the nation's reliance on imported food. Urban economies bore scars as well. For weeks, factories had slowed or stopped altogether, and though production resumed after the thaw, many businesses never recovered. Small workshops, particularly in textiles and metalwork, struggled to pay debts accrued during the stoppage. Families who had pawned possessions to buy coal found themselves unable to reclaim them. The frost deepened cycles of poverty that reformers would wrestle with for decades. In the longer term, the crisis contributed to calls for stronger labor protections, better housing, and more systematic relief in times of emergency. Politically, the frost became a case study in the failures of the poor law. The workhouse system, already controversial, had been exposed as both inadequate and inhumane during the freeze. Crowded wards, freezing dormitories, and mass pauper funerals became symbols of a system unable to meet real human need. Reformers like Beatrice Webb and Charles Booth used the events of 1895 to press their arguments for structural change. In the decades that followed, Their critiques influenced the development of early welfare measures, including pensions and unemployment insurance. The frost did not cause these reforms directly, but it provided powerful evidence in debates that reshaped Britain's social safety net. Public health was another area where the frost left its mark. Mortality records from 1895 revealed shocking spikes in deaths from pneumonia, influenza, and bronchitis. Medical officers used these statistics to argue for better housing, improved sanitation, and greater access to healthcare. The link between poverty and vulnerability to cold became harder to ignore. The frost thus contributed to a growing recognition of social determinants of health, an idea that would underpin public health reforms in the early 20th century. Culturally, the frost entered memory as both trauma and spectacle. Engravings of frozen rivers, photographs of soup kitchens, and stories of funerals in snow became part of Britain's visual and narrative heritage. Writers and poets returned to the frost as metaphor for inequality, for the fragility of empire, for the endurance of the poor. Preachers used it as an allegory of sin and redemption. Reformers invoked it as a moral lesson. In this way, the frost became more than a weather event. It became a symbol woven into the fabric of national identity. The frost also shaped Britain's relationship with climate. In the 19th century, winters were harsher than those that followed, but the extremity of 1895 stood out. Scientists debated its causes, speculating about atmospheric cycles and solar activity. The event spurred interest in meteorology and in the possibility of predicting extreme weather. Though the science was limited, the frost helped build momentum for the professionalization of climate studies in Britain. Later, historians would look back at 1895 as part of the waning years of the so-called Little Ice Age, when Europe endured colder, harsher winters than in the modern era. For ordinary people, the legacy was deeply personal. Families remembered losses of children to disease, of fathers to workplace accidents, of farms and businesses to bankruptcy. Communities carried scars in the form of poverty deepened, possessions sold, and opportunities lost. In some neighborhoods, the frost was spoken of for decades as a marker of suffering, a comparison point whenever winters turned cold. Not since '95, people would say, when temperatures dipped and memories stirred. For the empire as a whole, the frost carried symbolic weight. It revealed vulnerability at the heart of global power. Britain, which ruled colonies across the world, had been brought to its knees by ice and snow. For reformers and critics, the irony was sharp. An empire that claimed to civilize distant lands could not protect its own poor from freezing. For imperial administrators, the frost was a lesson in fragility, a reminder that the empire's wealth and influence could not insulate it from nature's wrath. By the turn of the century, the Great Frost of 1895 had entered history as the last great winter of Victorian Britain. Later decades saw milder winters, and the frost took on an almost legendary quality. It was recalled in memoirs, invoked in reformist speeches, and preserved in statistics and photographs. Its legacy was not only in what it destroyed, but in what it revealed: the resilience of ordinary people, the cruelty of poverty, and the need for change. In the end, the frost's legacy was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it spurred reforms in welfare, housing, and public health. Symbolically, it became a reminder of nature's power over human ambition, a season when the empire shivered and the divisions of society were laid bare. The Great Frost of 1895 was more than weather. It was a reckoning. and its memory endured as long as those who had shivered through it lived to tell the tale.